Terrific. Now we have two very exciting sessions this afternoon before we break once again, and for refreshments at around 3:30. Our next session is Public Sector Leadership, Making Australia a Better Place. This session will be moderated by Professor Mark Evans, who is the Director for the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis at the University of Canberra, whom we have discussed and I've quoted earlier today. And the speakers in this session are Glenys Beauchamp, who is the Secretary from the Department of Industry and Science, and Michael Pezzullo, who is the Secretary of the Department of Immigration and Border Protection. And once again, there will be questions from the audience in the last 10 minutes, so shoot your hand up, and if you don't mind, introduce yourself before you ask your question to the panel. But now I'd like to hand over to the moderator of this session, Professor Mark Evans.
Thank you, Virginia, and welcome back, everybody. This session explores how leaders in the public sector can be strategic in a context where politics are toxic, purposes may be hard to define, the stakeholder environment is contested and turbulent, where authority over the means for getting things done is often shared with other entities, and citizens have greater expectations than ever before for high-quality public services, but remain unprepared to pay for them. According to the 2014 Griffith Constitutional Values Survey, significant number of Australians have relatively low levels of trust and confidence in all the different levels of government, with a notable exception of the ACT. ACT citizens report 84.8% confidence in their territory government, by far the highest in Australia. Later in the survey, it is reported that 36% of all Australians believe that the current system of government with three main levels does not work well. These numbers are obviously a cause of concern, but probably not a ringing endorsement for change. Most significantly, 92.7% think that it is desirable that different levels of government be able to collaborate on solutions to problems, and 49.9% believe that Australian governments do not do this very well. Hence, it's the absence of cooperative federalism that is held to blame, not federal government. When asked about their preferences for the Australian system of government 20 years from now, only 4.8% call for the abolition of federal government, while 20.3% call for the abolition of state government, and 18.8% call for the strengthening of regional and local government. Now, as you're all aware, the Commonwealth Government has responded to the need to rethink the nature of Australian federalism with the introduction of a white paper on the reform of the Federation as a central component of the COAG agenda, which was also foreshadowed by the Commission of Audit's various recommendations for dealing with, I quote, wasteful democracy. The great irony, of course, is that this clarion call to rethink the nature of Australia's federal system of governance has been made at the same time as historic cuts to the federal public service and announcements of the relocation of certain agencies out of Canberra. The Commonwealth Government has created a constitutional paradox at the heart of the federal white paper. It appears to want to devolve responsibilities away from the centre, but this requires a strong national capital with strategic policy and regulatory capability. So these are clearly exceptionally difficult times to be a public sector leader, particularly at the Commonwealth level. What form of leadership is required to meet these strategic, adaptive, and collaborative challenges? How can you stay focused on addressing fundamental public policy problems in such a complex environment? Is it possible to actually build a high-performing workforce culture in a period of slash and burn? So to help us with these and other leadership questions, I'm delighted to introduce two of Australia's most enterprising and respected Commonwealth secretaries, Glenys Beauchamp and Mike Pezzullo. Glenys began her career as a graduate in the Industry Commission, and she is now Secretary of the Department of Industry and Science. How great is that?
All planned.
In the intervening period, she has worked in territory government, so she knows all about collaborative governance. She was secretary in the Department of Regional Australia, and in 2009, she received the Public Service Medal for outstanding public service in coordinating the Australian government's response to the 2009 Victorian bushfires. Again, a major challenge in collaboration and collaborative governance. And in 2013, at the Institute, we were absolutely delighted to award her an adjunct professorship in governance. Mike Pezzullo is Secretary in the Department of Immigration and Border Protection, and as you're all probably aware, is spearheading a major change process in probably our most politicised areas of government. Prior to this appointment, he was Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Customs and Border Protection Service, with an international reputation for affecting public policy innovation, which has been followed internationally. He's held senior positions in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and Defence, where he was the principal author of the 2009 Defence White Paper. So look, you can see that we have no better qualified public sector leaders to address our core questions in this session. So I'm going to first invite Glenys up to address us. I'm then going to put some questions to her. Then I'm going to do the same with Mike. And then in the last 10 to 15 minutes, we'll open up to the general question. Glenys Beauchamp, everybody.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you for that warm introduction. And some of those stats that you just gave are quite worrying, actually, in terms of promoting the Australian public service to all the young people I see in this forum. Really like to congratulate the University of Canberra and others for this initiative. I think it's a great inaugural event, and I wish I had been here to listen to Mr. Howard this morning. So congratulations, it's absolutely fantastic. And also I'm really pleased to be sharing this segment with Mike, and we've both been going through lots of reform agendas, and I've been there about not only building a brand new department but also abolishing it, and also bringing together many different organisations in terms of reinventing the portfolio that I currently lead about 5 or 6 times. So we're tackling similar sorts of issues, and I should say, whilst, and I think you're right about Mike's area being absolutely in the political, well, being reported in the press quite a lot. I'm really pleased about that because it's not me, which is great. But some of the things I wanted to talk about was that mix of we talk about public service leaders and private sector leaders, and I don't really want to look at the past because we've seen the command and control and the some of the comments about leadership in the past in the Australian public service, but more so looking forward and what organisations are facing and what particularly the leadership of those organisations face. And I think people often debate the question of leadership through the lens of our operating organisations, and whilst the focus is on the difference between public and private sector organisations, the assumption is that that requires absolutely different leadership attributes and requirements. So I just want to break that down a bit, and in a sense my department deals with 2 million or more business enterprises across Australia and indeed overseas, and my conversations, particularly with the bigger organisations, is they're almost like a public sector agency in terms of complexity and requirements and the like, but in terms of the challenges that face us, very, very similar. So some of the differences we see is obviously a lot of people say private sector organisations, more tightly defined with their objective driven by the bottom line, whereas the public sector is more ambiguous with multiple organisational goals and conflicting demands. And I think the primary one there is how do you satisfy taxpayers at the same time delivering services to some of the citizens and the like. So I think that is a real complexity that our organisations need to deal with. I think there is a higher level of accountability in the public service. and we're guided by public sector codes of conduct and the highest ethical behaviours. At the same time, there's an absence of market incentives in the public sector. And there's more a lot of people say that there's a more certain or enduring sense of direction in the private sector, and some public sector agencies reflect the government's priorities of the day but have a more certain future, and I think I'm an example of that doesn't necessarily happen, but I think the Australian Public Service is certainly an enduring organisation as well, more broadly. But I didn't want to focus on the differences. I wanted to focus on the similarities, as I said earlier. And public sector organisations are becoming more goal-oriented. Consumers and citizens, and indeed our political masters, absolutely demand it. The private sector organisations realise that to grow and become sustainable, high ethical values and approaches to triple bottom line are important. And I think the big organisations, even the Rios, the BHPs, the others that I deal with in the resources and energy area, they do talk about people, planet and profits quite a lot. And if they don't do that, they're not going to be sustainable in the longer term. I think important is the diversity in leadership teams results in better performance. And I was going to talk a bit about that because I think being in what was perceived as a minority group, and probably still is in some of the leadership echelons, I think women at the top of organisations, we need more women at the top of organisations, and I think there's absolutely a fantastic evidence base and research, whether it's through the British Columbia Thomson Reuters study, show that companies with no women on their boards underperformed when compared to gender diverse boards. And just in my organisation, which is industry and science, you'd expect to see prevalence of men. I think we've got up to now 41% of SES are women, and I think the APS average is around 39. Even though that's not fantastic yet in terms of 50-50, I think we're absolutely getting there. Some of the other similarities, contestability and value for money are critical concepts now in the public sector, particularly the contestability of policy advice and outsourcing of services. And so if Mike and I aren't doing our jobs well, certainly our political masters and others will go elsewhere to get both services and indeed what I see as our core business in terms of providing frank and fearless advice. And I think public and private sector organisations are coming closer on the value adding. A private company needs to keep up with consumer demand, and that requires the ability and skills to change, evolve and adapt and improve constantly. And I think we're always now in the public sector looking to that. And in terms of turnover of organisations and longevity, I think the industry department has been around in all sorts of forms since 1928. So whilst I said we've reinvented ourselves 5 or 6 times, and I think customs is probably older. The old customs organisation is probably older, but unless we take on the abilities to change, evolve and adapt and look at the future in terms of what's coming over the horizon, then we will absolutely wither and die. And I keep thinking, perhaps not PM&C and Treasury, they'll be here forever. So what is driving sort of some of the leadership changes in recent years? But if I was to pinpoint one thing that applies to both the private and public sectors, it would be the power of the consumer or the citizen. And so technology is probably takes on the lion's share of responsibility for this power shift. No longer can we as public servants say, well, we know what's best and we'll do what's good for you. We absolutely have to respond to the citizen and the consumer. There's access to information, choices and convenience. Means consumers and citizens now expect more for less, faster and more convenient access to services and customisation of services to meet their needs. And you can see, even when things happen overseas or someone's travelling overseas, the expectations of a citizen in terms of the Commonwealth Government stepping in if they get into trouble is indeed at the forefront, not to mention some of the expectations around safety nets and service delivery and other things as well. And it doesn't just stop at products and services either. And I think we're looking at the delivery of services and methods of government as well. And I think the initiatives around the Digital Transformation Office, our single business service initiative, absolutely key in terms of changing our business models. And I think it's more than just the front end, it's actually changing the business model and how we do business behind. So I think choices, contestability, convenience and competition is what's now driving us. But the other impacts, I guess, in terms of some of the challenges we all face, and it's not just the consumer or the citizen, is it comes out in the intergenerational report. I encourage people to look at that about productivity, participation and what's happening longer term. And I think both the private and public sector need to be aware of that. I think there's much more global instability, and I think my early days at the Industry Commission, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, it was a long time ago, I think we very much focused on a domestic market. I think the domestic market's gone, very much focus on a global market, and we are part of that global market, even in some areas a small supplier, although in terms of some of the products and services that we provide in resources and energy area in Australia, we're an absolute at the forefront in terms of supply, for example, of LNG. I think, and so those access to global markets are particularly important. One of the things I have noticed, though, in terms of the challenges we all face is the pace of change now, and I think there's always a fear that either we can't get out there in front and lead, or we have problems keeping up, and technology and disruptive technology is a good example there. And I think the other things, changing expectations and the role of government, particularly from our citizens and consumers. So what organisations do we need for the future? We need organisations which are strategic, adapt to change, innovate and lead change. And I think we can't just look at backwards performance and KPIs and how we've gone in the past. And a good analogy here is business investment, particularly in the industry area that I'm focused on, is not based on the performance of the past, it's based on consumer and business confidence of the future. And in a sense, we've got to have that sort of mentality in terms of where we go as organisations. So it's all about foreshadowing what's coming over the hill, but positioning organisations and people, particularly the skills and capability, to look at what is absolutely coming over the hill. And I think whilst we deliver services for the government of the day, will become, as I said earlier, irrelevant if we're not looking at that foreshadowing and positioning. So we do actually provide the services and support and advice governments are looking for. So developing skills and capability and providing that strong analytical evidence base is particularly important, and developing and leading ideas and what is the new reform front that's coming. It's not necessarily coming from Mike and I, it's coming from future leaders. So in the past we've had tariff changes in the dollar, national competition policy. What is the next wave of reform that we absolutely should be addressing? So I think developing those skills and entrepreneurship and adaptability skills is something that we should be taking more of a partnership role, particularly with universities. Some of the other characteristics of an organisation that I look for is agility, team-based, less hierarchical environments, and I'd love us in the public service to get away from this is my position number and this is what it says I do. I'd love to get a much more team-based, flexible, agile environment where people are chosen for skills and expertise, and they might be working on one project here one day and one project another day, but I think I've got my challenges cut out for me there. I think innovation and changing business models, and some of the work that we're doing in our portfolio is looking at secondments, exchanges and the like, but also changing our working environment, getting out of cubicles. I mean, when you look at a Google type environment, the more collaboration and interaction you can get with each other is so important. I think attracting talent, and particularly focusing on future leaders, and that's where I think being based in Canberra, we hear a lot of criticisms about the public service, whether it's through the Home Insulation Program report, the Scales report on NBN, or indeed many of the media and public commentators on how bad the public service might be. But one of my jobs and Mike's jobs is to turn around that focus on the public sector as a vocation, but more as a profession. And we've got absolutely fantastic professional approach and some competencies and achievements and capability that we should be absolutely proud of. So attracting talent to our profession is going to be a key part of that. So I'm happy to sign all you young people up as part of our future programs. I think being collaborative and well networked is particularly important area, and It's interesting in terms of being a woman that a lot of people will see these as soft skills. This is the hard stuff. And I don't know if people with families, getting 2 and 3 year olds to go with you and do what you like is pretty tough in terms of negotiation and leading by example and the like. So I think all of these organisational challenges for the future really reflect the fact that we can only deliver results through people, and hence the focus on a high performance organisation made up of high performing people. So what does that mean in terms of our future public sector leaders? As I mentioned, we are a professional public service, and I think we absolutely have to push that point. When I came into the public service, I think I was going to be a teacher or a public servant and saw it as a calling or vocation. No, I've got over that now. It's absolutely a profession that we should all be proud of and not seen as second rate to the private sector. We need to ensure management and delivery are well executed, and I get a lot of questions about the difference between management and leadership. Management, you absolutely have to systematise in terms of managing finance and resources and people and the like. So get a lot of the management stuff out of the way so you can focus on the leadership stuff and influencing people. We need to encourage problem solving through new ideas and innovation, and this is what I've found the most difficult part in terms of my leadership role in the portfolio I'm in at the moment. It's very risk averse, and probably for good reason. You get belted over the head if you make a mistake, and it's more the public servants that are taking the rap for things that go wrong, I think, as well. So I want to be embracing risk, encouraging people to have new ideas and innovate as much as we possibly can. As I mentioned, ensuring diversity in leadership positions is no longer a touchy-feeling, feel-good approach. It's absolutely imperative to delivering business outcomes and remaining competitive. And we need that focus on people to deliver results, and capability and skills, and motivating people is one of the hardest things to do. As I think you said, slash and burn. I'm thinking sort of slightly downsizing our portfolios, and we got mentioned in the financial review today in terms of the number of people that we have lost over the last little while. But we want to make sure we're not hollowing out skills. And although I should say that I was talking about hollowing out economists, and we've got a partnership with the University of Canberra where we're actually offering our graduate program and other officers a graduate certificate in management or economics. So we're certainly out there developing those skills. I think we've also got to encourage and do better at communicating objectives and strategic. Everyone hears about strategic plans and missions and vision. I think we absolutely have to walk the talk there. And I'm trying to encourage a culture where leaders do not hold their positions at all levels because they simply have got authority when they sit in a hierarchy. I don't want people to think they've got authority just because they're sitting high up in the hierarchy. We must recognise leaders because they can influence and guide people and add value by creating an environment for new ideas. And I've got a very simple definition of leadership, and it's your ability to influence others. And I think the work that we do, including Mike's organisation, are across government, whole of government activities and services, and if we can't influence our colleagues and others, then we shouldn't be in leadership positions. At a personal level, I think some of the things that we need to promote and encourage, although we get criticised when we do try and do this, is looking at resilience. How do we bring out that inner core of confidence in people? Being courageous. How do we encourage people to be courageous? And in the old days, the grey cardigan, public servant that kept their nose clean, we'll go out the hierarchy. I don't want that. I want people to take risks, be courageous. I think in a leadership position, you also need to be consistent. Be consistent in what you do and say, and not be just rhetoric. I think, as I've mentioned all the way through, valuing people and diversity and listening to others. And if you talk to my husband, he probably doesn't think I listen very well. I've got selective listening. But I think it is really important to listen and take on board diverse people's views. And in terms of problem solving, I get a lot more out of problem solving when I get teams of people together and whiteboard and workshop things rather than doing an analytical literature review and the like. I think we absolutely have to be leading out there in front and taking people with us. And I just wanted to give a couple, and I hope I haven't run out of time, just some of the things that we're doing in terms of a new organisation too. It's getting our strategic plan in place, you know, having all staff meetings and getting teams of people together. What is our value proposition? And I keep saying to the industry and science portfolio, what is our value proposition given that industry policy has changed enormously over the past 30 years or so? Focusing on learning and development and secondments into the private sector and industry and academia is particularly important. I know John Lloyd, the new Public Service Commissioner, wants to get a better understanding across the Australian public service of how business works. I think setting up our 2-year graduate program too has been absolutely fantastic, and so I'd like to respond to Verona Burgess in the Financial Review article, but I won't. But building a high-performance organisation and roadmap complements our strategic plan so people can see where they fit, how they might contribute, and my job is to provide the wherewithal and give people the skills and capability. And my key performance indicator is if I can bring out the best I possibly can in people, then I think I've done my job well as addressing all the big policy issues. But they're the simple parts. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Glenys. As you mentioned at the beginning, while doing much better than the private sector, the number of women at the senior echelons of the Australian Public Service isn't as good as it could be. Clearly you've been a success story in that regard. What has been the secret to your success?
Probably a few things. I mean, obviously you don't get there on your own, and whilst the public service focuses on merit and you'd like to think you're the best person for the job, I think you absolutely have to step up and take risks. And I know when I've been going to interviews at the senior leadership level, people have asked me, you know, when has the hair on the back of your neck stood up? And in a sense that is, have you done some really tough jobs? And I think I like to throw myself in the deep end and then look like I'm calmly getting out of it, but underneath I'm absolutely panicking. But if I sort of took a step back and thought, can I do this, can't I do this, then it probably wouldn't happen. So I've been quite opportunistic and shameless and sort of jumped in the deep end. I've had some good mentors ultimately, not planned either. And I think I've said to a couple of people in the audience before, I think one of my biggest champions was the boss I most hated. And I used to think, oh, what a tough person he was. And I could see what he was doing, because I guess from a woman's perspective, coming out of the Industry Commission where I was the only woman in the division, you do take you take a step back and you think, okay, I'll wait for things to come to me, but you've really got to get that inner confidence and core confidence to step up to the mark and make sure you're in charge of your own destiny. I think the other thing that I'm starting to see is I think we're getting more economies of scale and threshold of women in senior leadership jobs, and I'm particularly happy that I'm in a job that's, you know, industry and science. You know, it's not health or education or what they call the touchy-feely, even though I've come out of a social policy background as well. And I must say the social policy stuff is just as tough too. So I think the broad range of experiences, testing yourself with different people, different subject matter, I think that's what I'm looking for in terms of people that I'd like to get into our senior leadership group, plus also that passion and wanting to make a difference and have a bit of fun.
So what does the Australian Public Service need to do to make it easier for the next generation of women to realise their aspirations?
There's probably a number of different things we need to look at different levels. Obviously, recruitment and the talent pool. And I think we've got to make sure we do get the right people in the talent pool. It's a bit like when you're managing programs and grants programs and the like. There's some people that are particularly savvy at putting in applications and the like, but not necessarily the most meritorious. So I think we've got to get past the fluff and bluster and say, well, okay, can this person look at delivering the job, but also what's the potential of that person? And I think That's the other thing we've done in interviews, is looked at the record, backwards level of achievement rather than looking forward. So I think this organisations can do a lot in terms of supporting women, getting them to come along to boards, supporting young people to come along to boards, making sure there's got a good talent pool. I'm not actually a supporter of quotas, even though I think maybe that we'll be going there one day, although I don't mind targets. So we should be looking at absolutely diversity targets because it's good for business. So I think there's a lot of things we can do at the organisational level, but I guess at the personal level, people have to step up to the mark and take some self-responsibility as well. But we, as a department, need to give people the tools so they can do that. And one of the things that I commented on the other day, I was out of the workforce for about 8 years, bringing up kids. I think it was 3 under 5 at one stage, and I think people thought you didn't have a brain and the like. And when I went back into the public service, and of course with someone like your family and mother pushing you back in, saying, oh, you can do this, you can do that, you do lose self-esteem and confidence. But one of the things you probably need to do is think about the skills and attributes you do have. And I don't think we acknowledge, probably all of you, in terms of what skills and attributes you do have to do a job. And one of the things I encourage people to do at the end of the week, what did you do this week? What did you learn this week? Sometimes I've been writing not much down in terms of what I've achieved, Mike, like the last few weeks. But when you look back on it, you think, oh, right, okay, so, that is a really good achievement. That is a skill that I should be pursuing. Even looking after kids, negotiating skills, organisational skills, all that scheduling stuff actually counts for things. If you're working in a secretariat, for example, you have exactly the sorts of skills you need. So I think people have got to step up to the mark as well.
We hear a lot now about the importance of partnership building and working across boundaries. And traditionally, that's not kind of been a major focus of the work of the public sector. But increasingly, that is a focus in terms of, particularly the work in your portfolio. Yeah. What's the magic in terms of partnership building as you see it?
I think people's lives, households, the economy is much more complex than it used to be, and we used to see linear solutions to problems. I think when we look at some of the whole of government processes that Mike and I are involved in, the Federation you spoke about, the National Competition Policy Review, Taxation Review, things like the Agricultural White Paper, the Energy White Paper, they don't involve just my portfolio or Mike's or a whole range of others. They absolutely need to be coordinated across government at the APS level, but also with states and territories because of constitutional issues and indeed local government. So I think how I approach it, and I like approaching collaboration as a win-win in a sense. It's probably 80 or 90% you're going to agree on the policy framework and the policy outcomes. It's only the small part where you might have contention. I always think there's competition for views and new ideas is good. It's good for public policy development. We don't want groupthink. We don't all want to agree. We do want to have a bit of Barney around content and policy. So I think that's particularly important. But I think the more you know people, the easier it is to do business, and that's why networking and collaboration is absolutely so important. It's easy to ring Mike up and say blah, blah, blah. If I didn't know him, you'd be less inclined to do that.
Thank you, Glenys. Can I invite Mike up to the lectern to address the forum?
Thank you, Mark. I'm delighted to be sharing this podium with Glenys, and most, if not all, of the things I'm going to say have been covered to some extent, or indeed in whole, by Glenys. So we'll be able to economise on a bit of time. I also acknowledge, Peter Lay, your presence here, a wonderful colleague over many years, including when we served together on the Defence Committee, and I'm delighted to be here, Peter. I'd like to put a contention to the gathering that if you look at the really significantly disruptive junctures at the global scale since the Second World War, in Australia that's been characterised by what I would contend to be excellence in public policy and administration. So in the post-war planning and reconstruction phase, as the war was winding up, although still many hard battles to be fought, our predecessors were here thinking about post-war population immigration. Indeed, the department that I now head that I now head came out of that process and was established in July 1945. National infrastructure requirements, industrialisation patterns of industry that Glenys would well recognise, even though from a long era gone. Education, and so you saw the foundation, for instance, of certainly the ANU, perhaps not quite the University of Canberra, which I think is a more recent creation, and of course the Snowy Mountains scheme that emerged from that time. Then fast forward to the early 1980s, the economic reforms which are much talked about, which laid the foundation for a quarter of a century of economic expansion and growth in income and wealth. Fast forward again to the end of the Cold War, where whole new global and regional arrangements were established after the fall of the Soviet Union, the peaceful fall of the Soviet Union, although of course it wasn't as easy as it now appears to be. And you saw the rise of institutional bodies such as APEC, the ASEAN Regional Forum, new patterns of collaboration and so on and so forth. I would contend that these eras are characterised by high calibre decision-making processes and outcomes, characterised in Australia by very close working partnerships between governments, both Labor and Coalition, and a very strategic public service headed by elite, and I use that term advisedly, secretaries and senior officials, and supported by committed and knowledgeable staff who did, of course, all of the grunt work. Let's fast forward to the disruptive juncture that we are now experiencing. The multipolar world that's been emerging since about 2000, historians will date it at different particular points in time. Truly globalisation, which is expanding trade and travel flows all around the world and truly across the planet, as opposed to earlier manifestations of globalisation. The rise, of course, of China and India that hardly needs to be remarked upon. The emergence of pivotal states which have been on the periphery but in future will be significant decision-making bodies in their own right. States like Turkey, Indonesia, in our own neighbourhood, Brazil, Nigeria, Mexico, Poland. You can check the underpinning evidence for those claims yourselves. The rise of significant non-state actors, Al-Qaeda in the early part of this period, but more recently Daesh in the Middle East, which is actually controlling and influencing territory and creating global repercussions as a result. Cyber is much talked about, so is the power shift supposedly from west to east. The contention and question marks over the future of US power and the willingness of the US to engage and deploy that power. Economic interdependence clearly in such a globalising planetary environment will continue to grow, but will adherence to the post-war norms remain intact, or indeed even will they decline? Norms such as open trade, management of the commons such as air lanes, sea lanes, space, management of potential territorial disputes, the management of incidents at sea, and indeed, regrettably, as we've seen in recent years and months indeed in Europe, the use of proxy forces by state actors who are otherwise obliged under the UN Charter that they signed at the end of that Second World War period not to engage in the behaviour that they clearly are engaging in. And I just instance the events in the Ukraine in recent times. In this environment, Australia's weight in relative terms will decline, just it's a mathematical equation, and therefore our relative weight in terms of economy, military, trading and political weight will relatively diminish. This is crucially important, of course, in terms of our strategic and economic environment and our choices, the choices that we'll be able to make in that environment. These dynamics have the potential, there are many upsides to these developments, but they have the potential to increase the ability of others to coerce us and indeed to impact on our sovereignty, and certainly to reduce our influence in global and regional decision making, or at least we'll have to work harder to continue to be influential. And so therefore these changes to the global system of power and norms, which have been so beneficial for us in recent decades, potentially are unlikely to be to our advantage. And of course, in that quick checklist of global developments I haven't even touched on, although thankfully Glenys has, so this is an entirely complimentary presentation. Global people movements, which of course is significant in my business. Industry and technology changes that Glenys works on every day. Changes in terms of ageing and health profiles and demography more generally as we live longer. Changes to patterns of settlement. We are now more urbanised in relative and of course absolute terms than at any point in human history. What does that mean for the environment, for patterns of settlement and conurbation and living together? And of course the expectations of citizens in democratic systems. Will this era in future be seen as one characterised by high calibre decision-making processes and outcomes, characterised by very close working partnerships between governments, arguably the coalition at the start of that period, then Labor and now the coalition again, and a strategic public service headed up by, and I use that quote again advisedly, elite secretaries and senior officials, supported by committed and knowledgeable staff. Will the historians of the future look back at this disruptive period and characterise our decision-making processes with these terms? Dealing with these issues and their interdependencies is of course core business for government and the public sector. Many other actors have got a beneficial role to play, but frankly only the state has the principal levers that are going to matter. For instance, statecraft, the ability regrettably to wage war if that becomes necessary, and certainly to protect borders and global trading and travel patterns. Let me drill down to that contention. I could take that contention in many, many different ways: the power of the state, the role of government, the role of the public sector at large. But given that you have two of these beings in the room at the moment, secretaries are not often either have the time or allowed out of their citadels to address such bodies, and it's a lot of fun. It's a lot more fun than the word that I know is banking up as we speak. So let me just drill down to a particular question of the role of the state and actually look at the role of secretaries in this complex environment. I would contend, both in the past and in the present juncture that I've just described, and indeed in the future, that Canberra, and I'll just focus on Australia here, Canberra works best when governments and individual ministers are supported by a high-performing and talented group of secretaries who run their departments well, and indeed are allowed to do so, and who act as the preeminent advisors to their individual ministers and as appropriate to groups of senior ministers, including the Prime Minister, for example in my world by way of my attendance at the National Security Committee of the Cabinet, chaired by the Prime Minister. Wise and effective secretaries realise that his or her advice is contestable as against advisors in political offices, research think tanks, advocacy groups, academics, industry groups, commissions of inquiry and review. And this is a good thing. I agree with Glenys absolutely. For departmental advice to be useful, it has to be influential and compelling, based on strong evidence, and it has to be actionable and in conformance, of course, with the ideological and strategic agenda of the government. There's no point doing otherwise. The role of the secretary is not to hem or constrain a supposedly courageous minister, as in the stereotype of the wily mandarin who does everything to protect the government, which really means the secretary and the club of which he or she is a member, creating false choices for ministers or creating elegant paper trails which are simply engineered to deflect and sandbag. Departments which engage in this kind of behaviour, and some frankly do, or at least used to, I might not necessarily use the present tense in this wide audience, have since the early 1970s found themselves frankly frozen out and diminished in influence. And I would instance here the rise of the ministerial advisor from the early 1970s, and again that's a whole seminar and topic in its own right. Now frankly, departments should be able to produce better considered and researched advice than any office, think tank, advocacy group or individual academic. We just simply have the firepower to do so. We can harness talent if we choose to. We can build and maintain policy capability and strategic skills. We can focus organisationally on risk and future scanning, looking for both threats and opportunities. We can be imaginative and innovative. And at the very top, if we allow ourselves, we can focus strategically and give ourselves the time to do so and to do those other things that I've just said. I absolutely agree with Glenys that then turning it into action is critically important. And I would add one rider though. While implementation is very important, it cannot be content-free or policy-free. Action, of course, is what we do. We act first and foremost. But the cult of implementation, absent any strategic capability, as a substitute for policy and strategy, needs to be critiqued in my view. Because what otherwise arises is an obsessive focus on burdensome compliance reporting, mechanistic program management, and internal red tape within the bureaucracy. I should add one important rider over all of the matters I've just outlined. We must never, of course, be political, which I read quite technically and narrowly to mean working to the electoral advantage of the governing party. And that's as I read the Act, and that's as I read the Code of Conduct that sits within the Act. Otherwise, our job is to energetically implement the agenda of the government of the day. Let me finish these remarks by personalising leadership and drawing out some extracts from a letter that I wrote to the senior leadership of my former service, the Customs and Border Protection Service, which has been amalgamated on 1 July with my current department. I wrote a letter on the 1st of July. It was the first day of the new financial year, and I'd been appointed as the Chief Executive in the February of that year, and I said to myself, we're going to have some difficult conversations this year because we're dealing with some quite problematical issues, and we're going to have moments and instances to be able to celebrate achievements, and I'd like a common canvas against which to do these things. So I wrote a letter to each of our SES members and followed it up with one-on-one discussions with each of them. Let me just read you some extracts. I said, good leaders are good managers, and Glenys has drawn that distinction very nicely, so I won't further elaborate there, other than to say that leadership does go beyond mere management. We are, so this is the collective pronoun, and so the context here is the Customs and Border Protection Service of the time that I was writing to. We are one leadership team. We will act as a team, sharing credit and burdens. As leaders, we will be authentically optimistic, providing clear focus and positive direction to our staff and energetically seeking to overcome obstacles and challenges. Leaders, however, have to deal with failure and disappointment because that happens in the human condition, both individually and collectively. Leaders separate their ego from their position. If letting go of a position makes sense for the greater good, then ego should never be a factor in decision making. Leaders make decisions based on informed judgment, experience and intuition. We will focus as leaders on the most basic element of our job, which is to make decisions. We will focus on the strategic essence of any matter and issue and leave it to trusted staff to execute and deal with the detail. The best decisions reflect collaborative processes and cultures. Leaders own their decisions by making clear that they are responsible for the basis and the consequences of their decisions. Major decisions will, of course, be taken through a broader decision-making process, a collective process. We, the collective group, will own those decisions as well. If we have a dissenting view individually, that view will be prosecuted through the collective process. We'll have the courage to speak up at that point, at the appropriate time, and in the appropriate forums, and in the appropriate style. Leaders also look for real-world insights and clues which point to a signal in the problem rather than the noise associated with the problem. We need to get out and seek real-world feedback and field intelligence. Theory and doctrine are necessary instruments of analysis and decision-making, but should always be tested and stressed by reality, and particularly new information and different perspectives. Leaders take action and are action-orientated. We will engender a strong culture of achievement by ensuring that intended actions actually become reality and that plans result in intended outcomes. Leaders, particularly those at the very top of an enterprise, bring a comprehensive conception to plans, strategies and activities, and sometimes only they hold the broad view, the authority and the vantage point to deal with the most profound of issues. We will not over-exercise this prerogative, however, and will only intervene with purpose and effect. Leaders are not regulators of an enterprise outside of the system ensuring its compliance and conformance with external standards. Leaders are within the enterprise at its head, fully invested in its successes and failures. Leadership is organic and therefore very personal. Leaders are personally well organised and efficient and attentive to sound administration and management practice. Meeting these standards is actually a sign of respect, because personal disorganisation and the lack of attention to detail are signs of disrespect, because others, including me, and I was the Chief Executive at this point, rely on your attention, focus and decision so that we can do our jobs. And finally, leaders live by their values and support and exhibit the values of their organisation. And in terms of personal behaviour and ethics, we will of course comply with all stipulated rules and guidelines, but we will aim to go beyond these. We should, as a group, be known for exemplary behaviour and ethics, and so on, and so the letter went. It was about a 5-page letter which set out very clear expectations. It didn't set out KPIs or specific outcomes. That was dealt with in the administrivia of other documents. It formed the basis in some cases of some excellent discussions that led to people's careers being enhanced and groomed for greater things, and some of those officers have come through to more senior roles in the Department of Immigration and Border Protection. But it also led to some difficult but in the end mutually respectful discussions that saw a parting of ways, where there was either an incapacity to keep up with the stress and the pace that we were setting, or a misalignment of the individual's aspirations with the collective aspiration. All done very transparently and all off the same canvas. That's leadership, it's not management. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Just one quick question and then we'll open up. I mean, obviously you lead a portfolio that is traditionally characterised more with closed government than open government, traditionally, and where there's been major change management processes over the last 10 years. You run a portfolio where the political messaging, which kind of crystallises around, you know, the boats motif, is getting in the way of trying to encourage highly skilled immigrants to come to Australia. How do you balance those things?
Probably need a period of time, more than 4 or 5 minutes to answer that. But in summary, we anticipate, and this is indicative of recent trends, we anticipate continued strong growth in all visa categories. People want to come to Australia, people want to migrate here, but they also want to come here for study, travel, for purposes of leisure, romance, work and travel, and so on and so forth. There's been no diminution of the attractiveness of Australia to non-citizens or persons from other countries. We will, in the course of the decade that we're currently in, on average, bring in more permanent migrants than that which occurred after the Second World War. Now, obviously, the relativities are different. We had a remarkable expansion of our population from that period in 1945 when the department was established to about the early 1970s when the program started to taper. We tripled the population. No advanced country in the world has ever done that. And it was a remarkable achievement. And essentially, it's a historical mission that was long accomplished and should be recognised as such. In the time since, under both Labor and coalition governments, the migration program has actually become a temporary visitor program, by and large. Next year, we will issue something like 5 million visas, of which 4.8 million visas will be temporary. A week, a day, a month, multiple entries within a few years, but 4.8 temporary, about just under 200,000 are permanent. We have nothing to be ashamed about. We don't have any kind of issue around our brand, if you want to use that term, and we're one of the great beacons. In fact, that's one of the reasons why people want to come here, is that you can have as secure, as peaceful and as prosperous a life as anywhere in the world. And that actually creates a dilemma for us because, of course, 6.8 billion people cannot live here. And that's how you've got to manage that tension with a lot of transparency and clarity.
Thank you, Mike. Can we have another question for Mike from the audience? At the back.
Thank you. I'm Michael DePercy, University of Canberra. My question relates to public sector leadership in particular, and it's the most common question I get from my students. Firstly, what opportunities do you provide to encourage future leaders? But more importantly, what is an appropriate way for future leaders to make their potential known to you?
In several respects, the classical entry for a lot of the folks I suspect in this room has always been the graduate program. Like Glenys, we're looking at a reshape of our program. I haven't quite settled in my mind whether we're going to go to a 2-year program, but I am attracted. A number of agencies are doing that, and I think it creates a stronger platform for future growth and development. The problem I find though with graduate programs, and I avoided this trap in terms of my own personal career, I only stayed in the Defence Department for 5 years before I kind of worked out that having got to a reasonably senior middle ranking level after about 4 or 5 years, the experience, age and to some extent ideological and almost philosophical gap between me and the next level up meant that I would not advance to the next level until I became crusty, old and cynical.
Are you there?
Finally. So of my own volition, and indeed in the late 80s, actually to some extent some cultural scepticism and indeed resistance, I moved sideways. I went into the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet to extend my own career. And in those days, certainly, it was seen as a sign almost of disloyalty. Why are you going there? We hate them, or we don't work well with them, or that would be largely unheard of now. There are still a few departments that encourage the cult of what I call the lifer. So the second part of the answer to your question is a very active encouragement of mobility. I say to people who come to see me, Secretary, I'm thinking of moving. Would this be a problem? I said, well, you shouldn't even be asking the question. You should be asking what wonderful opportunities are there out there. And indeed, once I've enjoyed and exploited those opportunities and enriched my career and what I'm doing in my career, what can I do in coming back to that agency that I've left to do something either different or similar but at a more senior level? And so I guess there's a traditional graduate pathway, but there's also lateral at all levels. And certainly with the changes that I've been leading since my appointment in October, where we've turned over through delicately managed and sensitive processes about a third of the SES, the vast majority of their replacements have actually come in laterally. And so that's sending a signal throughout the whole organisation that subject matter loyalty is important, but subject matter knowledge, I should say, is important, but institutional loyalty, which I'm very sceptical about, is actually not valued in the way that it traditionally was. I think it's corrosive, frankly.
I was just going to add to that. One of the things that we're looking at, I think, when I was first coming in the public sector, were holiday programs and traineeships. So we're also looking at opportunities, particularly for students, to be located in a department for a particular period of time. And I think trainees and holiday programs are a good way of doing that. But I think, again, you should be forthright and opportunistic and contact the HR area and give them your CV and say you're very interested, because we're always on the lookout, particularly for new entrants at lower levels.
Final question from you,
Hi, Jessica Mullins from the University of Canberra. You both mentioned values in the Code of Conduct. So building on that, I'd like to ask, if it arises, how do you reconcile your own personal moral framework with political directives that may conflict?
I find it something that I don't have any difficulties with. I mean, growing up, I actually was perhaps one of the few people of my generation who actually wanted to come to Canberra to be a senior public servant. I didn't actually inevitably think I was going to become a secretary, but it was something that I was keen to try my hand at. It's like being a cricketer. So you sort of think, well, ultimately one day I'll get to be a Test cricketer, but if you don't quite achieve that level, you can still have a lovely career. No, Glenys, I didn't put it down in my notes as a 14-year-old that
Exactly. There's still time.
Maybe I did as a 15-year-old, but so I kind of had a sense of Australia's this sort of political and corporate entity that is run. It's run as a government, and there's lots of different stakeholders, but the framework in which they achieve prosperity, security, confidence to go about what they want to do is set by the Parliament, by the courts, and by the governments. I always wanted to be part of that. So for me, unless something is completely unlawful, and now as a secretary I've got a particular obligation to just remind ministers or those around them that there are ways to achieve things within the law, and perhaps that's what they really meant when they first articulated the objective that they were alluding to. No, my view is if you've been elected and you're strictly within the law, we have a positive, we actually have a moral duty to ensure that our democratically elected government, because that's a moral imperative in its own right, is able to achieve what it sets out to achieve. And then the rest of us, the citizens, as a citizenry, can then make judgment on that. Now, I know some people contest that. I know a distinguished former clerk of the Senate, the late Harry Evans, argued in contradiction to that, you need a more active citizenry because otherwise you have an elected dictatorship. Well, there's the halfway house because you have scrutiny through Senate committees, which Harry helped set up, of course. You have all sorts of scrutiny, particularly in this day and age of social media, and you have FOI and you have other processes. So I don't think it's quite binary. But the important thing, and I think you're trying to draw me on this, and I'll just have to respectfully decline the invitation, I think it is very, very important that if you hold something from a faith point of view or from some other emotional or moral point of view that leads you to be uncomfortable about something, you've really got to make a decision about leaving that area. So you can still work in government. So if you're a Quaker, for instance, and you are absolutely legitimately from the point of view of your faith opposed to war, you probably shouldn't join the Defence Department. So you probably need to make informed choices about where you're going to work and then take it from there.
I think I think people have got choices, and I think that's why I was trying to get towards the professionalism of the public service. There's two areas that I've worked in and been responsible for where I've given my staff the opportunity not to be involved. And that's when I was working in the health department on abortion policy, and the other one was a safe injecting room. And there were people who could not manage their personal from their professional. And so they were given the choice of whether they wanted to be involved or not. I think at the more senior levels, we are professionals and we do have choices, and whilst, and we're all voters as well, and whilst you may not necessarily agree with a particular way forward, we can still provide frank and fearless advice, but it's got to be based on evidence and the way forward, not on how you feel and what your emotions might be, or what you believe in. Although I think from the public service point of view, in terms of values, and certainly in managing large organisations, you can't do that by prescription. You absolutely have to do it by values and like-minded signing on to supporting the government of the day, the professionalism and the like. But I think probably most people in this room have a choice. Yeah.
Well, many thanks to you both for sharing your ideas with us this afternoon and being so generous in your time, because as you can see, two very, very busy people, so it's been wonderful being able to listen to your views on these issues. Mike Pezzullo and